Welcome to this episode of the Critical Accounting Podcast. My name is James Brackley. I'm really pleased to be here today with Professor Christine Cooper of the University of Edinburgh, co-editor-in-chief of Critical Perspectives in Accounting, Business and the Public Interest, and with editorial positions with accounting organisations in society, AAAJ, Accounting Forum, and others. So please enjoy the episode and do get in touch if you'd like to find out more about the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Christine.
Thank you.
Just to start off, would you be able to tell us a little bit more about what you see as some of the main themes, I guess, running through your work? I think it's fair to say you've got a real diversity of things that you've looked into, and both theoretically and empirically. Would you be able to give us kind of a brief introduction or summary to your work?
Yeah, oh my gosh. So actually when I saw that question that you kind of like sent me in advance, I was thinking about it. And I guess there are different ways to answer that question. But I thought I'd start with a kind of, I suppose, like an old woman version of why I did that, or how I kind of developed these theoretical perspectives. So I was born in 1956 to a very working class family in southeast London. So the house that we lived in, it had 2 rooms upstairs, 2 rooms downstairs, and an outside toilet. And we only lived in the 2 rooms upstairs. So this is like 1950s London, big housing shortages. But probably lots of people lived like that. So, it's not really that bad. But, there were, at that point, my parents had 3 children. And then later on they had another 2, but we lived in a different house. So, so I came from, quite a working class background. But I really benefited from the amazing education system that we had in London. I went to an amazing primary school and I went to an amazing secondary school that was a big kind of experimental London comprehensive school. So, and of course in the 1960s, when I did a lot of my education, there were lots and lots of new ideas. And of course, we weren't necessarily taught these at primary school or secondary school. Nonetheless, there were lots of progressive ideas and lots of big social movements that kind of fed into, I suppose, my formative years. But really there were 2 things that I really wanted to work out the answers to. One was just a very, I remember looking around and seeing lots of people doing different jobs. And of course my dad was a foundry man, and my mum, when I was little, she was a housewife. And I suppose we were brought up with this kind of rhetoric of choice. So you kind of you choose your career. And I was thinking, I remember watching a guy once, a street sweeper, and it looked really hard work. And you can say, well, he was out in the open and, doing a socially important job. But it's did that guy choose that job? Why didn't he choose to be a CEO and fly around the world and have private jets and, big expense account and live in a big house? So I was kind of worried. I suppose I always wanted to know how people got to the positions that they were in. And I suppose the other one was kind of, more egocentric. It's when I went to my secondary school, it was an amazing school, and it was a big social mix of, very affluent children, and it had an Oxbridge year, and it had, did very, very well academically, this school, although it was a comprehensive school. And so I suppose I started to mix with other, rich kids, and it's they just seemed to know how to wear clothes. And it was so how do you learn those things? And I suppose I was always so I suppose I was concerned about the economic, but I was also concerned about how people were kind of constituted as subjects, although I couldn't use that language. So, and actually, throughout the whole of my academic career, those have been the 2, so theories that speak to those things, I think have kind of dominated, the research perspectives that I use. The other way of answering this is a more kind of academic answer, is, sometimes people have just said, look, you need, I remember when I started with Marx, but but then I read Marx before I became an academic. So I remember reading the Communist Manifesto. I was probably 13 or 14. So Marx, I suppose, was like my first big theorist. But also, reading Engels, like The Family, Private Property and the State, and those kind of books that I also read when I was, quite a kind of young teenager. So I suppose that's like my foundational ideas. But then when I became an academic, of course, people would suggest things, and they would say, you should read this or that. I like the idea of reading new, different things. So I mean, I've always kind of loved theory in that way. But also, I suppose you have to be a little bit pragmatic. So you kind of look at journals and look at which theories are likely to run with them, because you do have to publish. So sometimes I might use a theory because I knew it was going to, but I wouldn't use a theory that I hated or I didn't agree with, but I kind of like, this would actually run with the journal. And I suppose the outlier to that would be the Helen Sixou kind of French feminist research that I did. And that was also very, very personal. So I became pregnant, and I think up until that point, I suppose I would say I was a kind of feminist. But I don't think I really thought too much about the oppression of women. And there were so many things, like people's attitude changed towards me when I was like going to become a mother rather than just being a kind of like a young woman or something. And I suppose I kind of felt that, and I wanted to kind of understand it. And I don't know how I found Helen Sixou, but I remember I was reading La Journée, and she spoke about sitting in a tree, looking down at the world, feeling really angry about the loss of women. And I can remember thinking, this is exactly it. So the French feminist work, I suppose came out of my personal experience of wanting to try to understand the role of women and what equality meant and how gender discrimination worked. And then I suppose that kind of helped me to understand that the world is like, and I think we're probably more aware of that. Yeah, and young people, some young people are really, they want to play with gender, and, there's lots of discussions about gender neutral toilets and all, so I think we're kind of getting, I don't know, to completely understand the importance of gender more. So I was just late coming to this, but, and I think now young people are really getting onto it. Anyway, so that's where the French feminist theory came from.
Well, no, it totally makes sense in terms of if you're interested in questions of the subject and the subject under capitalism, which kind of links to Marxist and post-Marxist ideas, then the link to the kind of the governmentality, the post-structuralist interpretation of that. And what I really liked about there's a 1992 paper, I think it's The Nom and Non of Accounting for Mother Nature. And you pick up on some of these ideas in the accounting and governmentality, but you also then bring in this aspect of gender, and you talk about how it's kind of the competitive, utility maximizing perspective of kind of neoclassical economics does have quite a gender perspective to it as well. I know you did actually write a piece reflecting back on that 1992 piece. How do you reflect back on that 1992 piece now? Do you think those Helen Sixou, which I know you've used more recently as well, is that still a useful framework we can draw on?
So I do think that's still a really interesting, important perspective. What I found really interesting was there was a piece by Arrington and Shearer in AOS about the same time. And at the time, Ed Arrington was a colleague of mine, so, we used to talk about these ideas a lot. And they used a theorist called Lucy Rigarai, who is not the same as Helen Sixou, but nonetheless, they do have, some kind of, certain kind of overlapping, I suppose, ideas. And both of them really useful to understand accounting. But actually, and that work was in the early 1990s, and it's never really taken legs in accounting. And I used to think, to be honest, it's hard. It's difficult theory. And these are also women writers, so so there's going to be something about their position and whether like the way that people understand them. They're basically just feminists, and but of course they offer huge. They have a lot of things, really interesting things to say about the world. So we started in CPA to ask people to do some reflections papers. So like some of the really interesting work that was going on, especially in the late 80s and a little bit into the early 1990s, it was really groundbreaking. So we just wanted to kind of get a sense from people, did their work, I don't know, did it change anything, what do they think about it now? And, I suppose just to get people to look back. And so anyway, so I don't know if it's Jane or Eve said, look, Christine, you might want to look at the Helen Sigsil work. So anyway, I had a colleague at Strathclyde called Daniela Senko, and she was really interested. So we both kind of, and I thought it was going to be nice to work with someone else on this. The way that I reflected on it was, I think the 1992 paper was really weak on trying to really get underneath what the gendered nature of capitalism and neoliberalism and the world in general, and so we tried to do a much stronger paper. And so in the new paper we used the work of Wendy Brown to kind of revisit the idea of the kind of like the masculine and the feminine in terms of language. And Wendy Brown made some amazing kind of for me insights. So I think she says things like you think the opposite of freedom is not to be free, but it's to be encumbered. So but really so we really drew in the second paper on Wendy Brown's insights, and we also tried to, I suppose, make the theory more accessible. In the original version, we still had Lacan and Freud. Well, we have Lacan still, but we kind of had like the Oedipal complex and those kind of much more Freudian understandings of the constitution of subjectivity. And one of the male reviewers just didn't want that, didn't get that stuff or didn't want that stuff. So we in the end we decided we'd take it out because it may have detracted from people kind of really getting the arguments. So so part of the theoretical kind of underpinnings, which were in the 1992 paper and not in the later paper, because we wanted to really sell those ideas a lot more.
Yeah. But I find all of this really interesting, how the field gets kind of introduced to new ideas, and it's probably worth maybe briefly mentioning on the kind of the feminist currents is it's not just the question of gender in and of itself, it's also the really interesting methods that critical feminist thinkers have sort of developed, which then can be applied elsewhere. So yeah, thank you. I'd like to ask you a bit about another sort of big concept that you've used in your work and developed, the idea of neoliberalism. I know you were involved in a special issue relatively recently on neoliberalism and management accounting, and you've developed ideas like the entrepreneurial self and the kind of idea of management accounting maybe territorializing or deterritorializing in other spaces. Could you say a bit more about how you see accounting as contributing to our understanding of neoliberalism, and maybe vice versa? Does neoliberalism help us understand how accounting works?
I think neoliberalism was a word that I suppose, like being in lots of lefty organisations and groups and stuff like that, so, we started to use this word neoliberalism. And I think it's taken us, I suppose, a long time to understand exactly what was happening. So when Margaret Thatcher, for example, started to privatise everything, or it looked like she was, but actually, it was much more strategic in the way that she carried out her privatisation programme. But for us, we used the word neoliberalism to at least understand what that was like, one of the drivers of privatisation. And I think, which by the way, I do think that is the case, because now I kind of think neoliberalism, I mean, it's like all the stuff that's happening in the UK in like the past few weeks is basically so anti-state, and so much, and I think I tried to pick up this with the work of the entrepreneurial self, so much to do with making people stand on their own 2 feet. So it's almost back to my childhood. I mean, of course, like neoliberalism, of course, I mean, those ideas were around then, through Hayek and people like that, but they weren't really well accepted. But now it's almost like this has become the norm again. If you're a street cleaner, you've chosen to be that. There's no social imperatives at all. And if you're a managing director, it's because we live in a meritocracy, and you've worked really hard and you deserve to get to that position. So there's no social obstacles at all anymore. So the fact that your parents send you to a Eton or whatever, or the fact that your parents send you to the local school that's got holes in the roof and shortage of teachers and equipment and all of that stuff, it doesn't matter. You're still getting the same as if you are getting the same education. So, and your social contacts don't matter, and so yeah. But so we knew that, like, we kind of understood about shrinking the state in terms of, especially post-war, so many European governments, really developed a lot of nationalised industries, really to build their country after the war and as a lever of full employment and all of that stuff. And so they were kind of getting rid of that. But then there was also the governance issues. So it's like who really governs everything, and basically everything should be governed by markets. So, and I think, we might have kind of said that stuff, but I think now we kind of understand that a lot better. So in terms of accounting, it's always how accounting can be configured to meet that kind of agenda. So things, and I suppose as academics, we're kind of really constrained now by like the need to publish, all of the metrics. So we've just been through this huge, as you know, research assessment exercise in the UK. I mean, perhaps when I retire, I might try and do some work on the cost of that, because universities, they have these huge systems and administrators. And I remember the week before we were going to get the results, I had to do a lot of training on understanding them, and had to deal with the media, and so that, like, this is this huge thing that really puts fear into the hearts of most academics, because you're never, even if you could have written the best work, and if it's just outside of the ref period or whatever, it just doesn't count. So this idea that you're really left to your own devices, and so you work in an organisation and you're subject to really often controls that you have no say over, that are often unfair. There's all the stuff on functional stupidity that lead you to do things just to meet the metrics, even though it's completely bonkers and you would actually be better to do other things. Nonetheless, you're kind of left with all of that stuff. So there's part of the kind of paradox then is, you're told that you're an entrepreneur of yourself. You're able to, you're supposed to be able to make all choices and decide how, what you're going to do. But the fact is, and if you fail in an organisation, the state safety nets have been so removed that, you're going to be in for a really, really hard time. And so I suppose that's going to make you, in some senses, a more pliable employee. So you're kind of like, it's almost like you've got this schizophrenic situation where you're told, you're free and you can do all this and you can make choices and blah, blah, blah. And then you work for an organisation and you're basically completely controlled by metrics, that you have no say over. So I mean that's just like one way that accounting operates under neoliberalism. But I think, I mean, one thing that I would say in the accounting literature is that the very early work in, let's say, accounting organisations and society was, lots of that was concerned with, not all of it, but, there was a good body of work that was concerned with labour process theory and like the experience of workers. And pretty much, some people are going to give me counter cases to this, but I mean, it seemed to me that kind of work really stopped. And now we look at other, I suppose, aspects of accounting. So to actually return and kind of try and put ordinary people in their working lives, which is pretty much, the majority of people across the world, to try to put those back into the like academic accounting literature as a concern is actually quite important.
Yeah, so it's both understanding how what people do and the work that people do is kind of valued, and then also how the way people experience work is shaped by the kind of the performance measures, the accountability measures that we see in everyday life. Sorry, go on.
I'm just going to say it's really interesting that you use that word accountability, because in the 1970s, when Rob Graham and people like that started to really bang on about accountability, it was always, we're going to hold big organisations to account. And then all of a sudden, accountability becomes, no, you have to account for everything to your employer. So it was like it was a concept that was completely turned upside down.
Yeah, well, that's super interesting. I'll put references in the in the video as we go. I mean, I know you've written about this elsewhere as well, but the Neoliberalism and Management Accounting, Reconfiguring Governmentality and Extending Territories. I think the introduction in that piece to the history of kind of liberalism and how it transfers into neoliberalism, through the sort of, the development of kind of technology and as you say, the change in accountability. So I found that really useful. So thanks for touching on that and summarising that a little bit. I'd like to ask a slightly different question, but maybe related actually. What is your view of the big accountancy firms and their role in society? And also maybe bearing in mind that as accounting academics, we teach accounting and we potentially send a lot of our students into the accounting industry as well. So yeah, maybe also the reflections on kind of a critical education.
Yeah. So I think these. Well, I mean, of course they're all linked. I will deal with the second part, like our students. So you probably won't mind me saying this, but like one of my co-authors, that now I'm doing a lot of research with, is Johnny Tweedy, and he was actually one of my undergraduate students, and he was also my PhD student, and now he's like flying, and honestly, he is really smart and hardworking, great academic. But at the end of the fourth year, and like in Scottish higher education, you do 4-year degrees, so like coming towards the end of the fourth year, I know that he was offered a job with a Big Four firm. And he also was thinking about doing he loved, the academic side of his degree program. So he was also like thinking about doing a PhD, but he needed a scholarship to do that. And I remember clearly saying to him, look, like if you were my son, I would tell you to go into the Big Four. And it's like, why, this is Christine Cooper, and all the stuff that she's written about the Big Four, why would she say that? And I think it was partly to do with, like, being an academic in the 21st century is hard. It's completely overwhelming in terms of the amount of work that you have to do. And we have workload models and so on and so forth, but really they don't reflect the amount of time that we spend on all the different aspects of our job. And I suppose I feel really sorry for new academics, trying to do all the stuff that you need to do to try. I mean, even to get your first job now, you really have to have publications. So you don't even have a kind of like a break after your PhD where you can kind of consolidate it and think about it and think about how you're going to publish some of it or which other areas you'd like to go into. Honestly, I love our students, and for me, it's always been one of the joys of my life. I get the chance to talk with young people every year and see how ideas change, and I really enjoy having students. But the classes are getting much, much, much bigger. There's pressures also now on students. So we like the whole world is now much more pressured, and I'm not sure that it's any better for that. I mean, so if you said to somebody, right, look, we're going to give you an extra year to work on this publication, and we're going to give you some time to do it, I think the publications will be much better. I mean, I think, everyone is probably sends things in a little bit too early, or, they just completely comply with what the reviewers say to try and get their work published, even if perhaps they don't agree with everything, or it's going to push the paper in a direction that they don't want to go. And they're I suppose the least bad things. Anyway, so that's why I recommended that. And his response, which is completely true, he'd done an internship at one of the Big Four, and he said if you go to work for a Big Four, you're under also the same pressures. You get to a certain level, and it's your billable hours and how much income you're bringing in. There's a real presenteeism kind of thing. People do work very long hours. People are expected to just travel, even if it doesn't suit them. Yeah, so given that you're going to be pressured in both environments, and to be fair, honestly, I'm sure that the choice he made was completely right for him. But if you go into academia from do a PhD and then go into academia, and you're publishing, because it's not a meritocracy, there is luck involved. I think we try and make it a meritocracy, but it's imperfect. If you get a couple of rejects, you're not going to get through your probation. That's it. You're going to be out. So I don't know. Yeah. So I think the thing about going into the Big Four is, for all students, it's a career path job, which there are very few of in the 21st century. And I can see that there are huge pressures. But I suppose I also see students from over the years, especially from Strathclyde, now work in Edinburgh, and the student population is slightly different, but I'm sure that there are students at Edinburgh that are exactly the same as this. And they come from really poor backgrounds, and this is their chance, I suppose, to have a better standard of living. So I kind of feel I shouldn't be the person to say they shouldn't do that.
Yeah,
and I think when they get to the profession, it's up to them really, the moral choices that they make. And I think if students have had the opportunity to actually think about the world and understand the role of the Big Four, I don't know, I don't think they're going to change very much in the Big Four, because these are massive institutions, but they may be able to find arenas within the Big Four that actually suit them. So so anyway, firstly, I don't think I should tell anyone what they should do with the rest of their lives, but I can actually see that this is life-changing to get a job in the Big Four and do well. And we all know that people that are, slightly better off, they're better health, their lives are richer.
And it's an incredibly, absolutely. Yeah. It can be a very formative experience, even if it's an experience you kind of find difficult or reject. And obviously, with the way the graduate entrance work, it's kind of usually a 3-year graduate program. And I should probably say I did a 3-year graduate program at PwC, and then I actually did the opposite. I came back into academia. So for me, it was kind of really nice and refreshing, because I wasn't an accounting undergrad. So to discover critical accounting, I found really interesting and exciting coming the other way. But I think what you're saying is absolutely right. I mean, in the sense that it's, even if you don't stay in the Big Four, and most people don't who do the graduate program, you learn a lot of kind of it's an experience that's hard to kind of replicate elsewhere. And I suppose our job as educators is we can at least make sure people are going into that with their eyes open and with a critical understanding of the profession and accounting and what accounting is and does as well, which is kind of what you've touched on.
So I didn't. Shall I do the first part of the question? So
what was the role of the big accounting firms in society? If you can answer that, it's quite a broad question.
Yeah, so I'll just say one little part of that, because this is something that I'm researching at the moment that I didn't know, and I kind of knew a little bit, but I never really kind of thought about it in enough detail, which I kind of should have done. So this was my COVID research, and this probably kind of kept me going through COVID, was reading Margaret Thatcher's archives, and I was specifically interested in the role of accountants and consultants, and in those days it would have been the big 8, I think. Anyway, I think it was down to 8 by then. So, and what really shocked me was that the big 8 actually had little impact on the government there were some consultants, but they weren't like the big consulting firms that we kind of imagine now. So it's really interesting. So, I mean, it's almost exactly the same as Liz Truss. So Liz Truss, lots of her ideas, they don't necessarily, some of them may come from big 4 firms and McKinsey's and Boston Consulting or whatever, but she actually gets her ideas from right-wing think tanks, and that's been true since her time at Oxford. And Margaret Thatcher, she didn't get her, she was also the same as the Institute of Economic Affairs kind of think tank, and of course Mont Périgord behind that, and so on and so forth. This is where she got her ideas from. And some of her advisors, like Ibbs and Rayner, they were just basically business people that she got in that she didn't even pay. So different role really. And so there's some documents in the archives where there's something called the Management Consultants Association, which was some of the big accounting firms at the time, and I think it was McKinsey's or one of big, now we'd recognise as a big consulting firm, and they came to make a presentation to Margaret Thatcher about what they could offer to government, and what she scribbled on it, because she had her own guys that were doing this for free. And she did try to kind of make accounting change government and make it more business-like and so on and so forth. But she saw these guys as actually being too expensive. And then because of the whole DeLorean thing, she really didn't like Arthur Andersen, which was like one of the biggest accounting firms. So what we know from... So in the UK, I would say by the time Thatcher left in 1990, there wasn't much penetration of the big accounting firms or management consulting firms into government. And I know that they worked very hard at doing this. And I know that Arthur Andersen's in the US, they had 2 different quite public campaigns to try to change government accounting to kind of more accruals-based accounting than cash-based accounting. And they had these big kind of scare pieces that the government didn't know their debt even. So they were kind of they actively kind of moved to get into government. And we know that some quite senior people in New Labour, after they kind of lost their seats, like in Thatcher landslide elections, they actually went to the Big 4, to their consulting wings, and kind of developed policy. So lots of New Labour policy was developed, at least in association with some big accounting firms. So when Tony Blair won the election, it was almost like he slid into government. So, I would say since then, and I've heard people say even about the Scottish government, look, nobody moves without consulting a Big 4 accounting firm. And the extent of that, I'm saying that, and I have no evidence, this is just repeating what someone said, but there isn't, it's really hard to get really good evidence. But if you go to the like the government's own accounting website, they spend an awful lot of money on consultants. And there's, lots of people now that I suppose know more about this than I do in public administration that say, look, the big problem in Britain, just at the very least, is we don't really develop civil servants anymore that have got this really good in-depth knowledge, because they just ask the big consulting firms. So it's really interesting that if neoliberalism means small government and government by markets, we also have a situation where the government, I don't know, is growing, but it's definitely growing in terms of its finances, because it's having to pay for these consulting firms. So when the government say we're pouring this number of £1 billion or whatever into something, a lot of that is actually going straight into the coffers of big consulting, big accounting firms. And I think I suppose the thing that I think is just beginning is that these big accounting firms now, they want to be more involved in the operational aspects of government. So I know in Scotland, we just had the census. It was a year after they had it, or in England at least. The operations of that was done by a big four accounting firm. And I think they really didn't do a good job, because we didn't get enough responses. And I think lots of the COVID work, some of the operational side of that was also carried out by big accounting firms. And they're just the ones that I know about off my head. So the big four firms, of course, they have their same audit role and risk analysis and advice to firms. But they also now to say they run government is probably completely not true. But they're really, really embedded now. Well, definitely in the UK in government. And it's probably not the same in other European countries. The truth is, I don't know about that. But the big four firms, or perhaps the accounting profession, but probably I'm really talking about the big four firms, they seem to be bomb-proof. There's we have a financial crisis where, huge, Lehman Brothers and other big financial institutions, their accounts were really shown to be not worth very much. And yet all these big firms have just received clean audit reports in terms of going concern and so on and so forth. So, I don't know, and all that happens is we just get more accounting.
Yeah, I mean, this question of audit failure is definitely one of the big kind of contradictions at the moment. I think Prem Sika put something out fairly recently about the latest round of regulatory reform being kind of moving around the deck chairs and not really addressing the sort of core question of audit failure. And then at the same time, like you say, these firms are very influential, and as well as what you're describing in terms of the backstage, they also act like kind of think tanks, don't they? So they'll put out public-facing documents and try and lead the debate on.
So this is years ago. We were doing privatisation of prison research, and in the US, the big consulting and big accounting firms would hold these seemingly academic conferences to really promote 3 strikes and you're out. So, to expand the private prison population. Yeah, they had a strong hand in that.
Wow, that's really interesting. I'll definitely put something in the podcast linking to that research. If it's okay, I'll move on to my next question. I wanted to ask, and it kind of does follow on this because we've been talking about the influence of the audit firms. As critical accounting scholars or as a discipline, how do you think we can go about kind of making a difference? And I guess this goes to the heart of what is critical about critical accounting, because it's not just about a neutral observation of the facts, is it? It's about the role accounting plays in society, and that implies a kind of a discussion, at least, of what sort of society we ought to believe in, I suppose. So how can we as critical accountants bring that sort of criticality and into kind of making change outside of academia?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I think this is the really, really, really important question. But I suppose the context of that question is like the stuff that I've said, that people are completely overwhelmed in any case with work. So like to kind of say, look, like your finance colleagues, they're sitting in their rooms doing their, big data analysis. And I'm not saying anything about the quality of that research, but then you have to say, well, if you're not to publish in this kind of critical area, then you should be doing some even more work and going out and making your ideas count. Is actually, I suppose, a big ask. But I suppose we probably should be doing a better, and this is probably true with lots of different arenas of academia, is we probably should be doing a better job of trying to engage with organisations that are trying to change the world. But at least, I suppose pursue different agendas from a completely ultra neoliberal agenda, I suppose talk to them about what research would be helpful for them, or how our research might inform what they do. And I suppose there are big organisations like Joseph Rowntree that do great jobs with linking up with academics and doing really good reports and so on and so forth. And I think the more people that can do that or engage with these organisations, the better. But so I suppose speaking truth to power is a bit too much. And I suppose, keep telling this. I suppose this is what Prem Seeker has done all of his life, through Left Foot Forward and some of the places where he writes, is to keep on, calling people out and saying what he thinks is really going on, and So it's kind of I think it's hard. I mean, I was at this is years ago. I was at a meeting where we were encouraged to kind of make industry partnerships, and the government was giving research money for people that made these partnerships. But what the sole criteria was: are you going to help these big companies make more money? So there was I don't want to name them, but there was a big power company came to a meeting, and it was basically, look, we're getting all this data from smart meters, so how do we actually monetize that? And it's like, well, as academics or critical academics, we should be asking, how is that going to help us help the most disadvantaged in society? What kind of information? Of course, it's really, but just this idea that we're just going to be able to sell that information and make money. And when I made this point, I think the people that were running the event, I think they were pretty cheesed off at me. I was saying, look, I don't want to help necessarily companies make just more money on selling our private data. I mean, okay, it's anonymized and everything, but so I think I suppose it's hard, because we have, but now we can do impact case studies. I guess perhaps there may be, this is a UK thing, so it's probably not true internationally, but so perhaps then there may be some more support in universities to give us time to do that kind of stuff.
The way you're describing it in terms of how our own sort of practice and field, in terms of how we're structured as an academic sort of field, I guess, links to the kind of knowledge we're creating. Because the impact case studies itself that then implies that you need to work with people who are prepared to talk to you, and they might have their own sort of messages that they might want to produce. And like you said, the precarity and the casualisation in education, we need time to think. And I guess if you're on a casualised contract, it's more difficult and more scary maybe to be critical.
And I might just be talking about Edinburgh here, but I do I don't know, I get that. Well, definitely at Edinburgh, they do value critical research, and I think they would be completely happy to work with you to try and do more kind of NGO collaboration and things like that. So it may also depend on, I don't know this, but that may be just true across all institutions, but I get the feeling some of the things that have happened recently in different universities, that may not be the case. Nonetheless, so perhaps it's also, when you're interviewing for a position, to find out what the university, if they're going to support critical research and, I suppose less lucrative forms of research in terms of getting money from government and, like you say, I don't think the big four, I don't know, I don't get the idea that they actually give that much money to academia. In the UK, they do in the US.
I just, in fact, you touched on data and this idea of selling data. My last main question actually was, you wrote a paper on the perils of AI in academic publishing. Could you say a little bit more about data collection and artificial intelligence in the review process?
Yeah, so this was actually an idea that was kicked off by Eve. And it came from, I think, our experience of different publishing platforms with Elsevier. So when I very first became an editor at CPA, up until that point, David and Tony had done everything on paper. And there was an online platform with Elsevier for CPA, but they didn't use it. And they were concerned about, I suppose, academic freedom and what would happen if like Elsevier was in charge of the review process and so on and so forth. And I honestly, the amount of, I suppose, boring work that created was like, I did my generation. I think the new generation probably doesn't even think about this. But if I wanted to submit a paper to CPA, firstly, you had to know if it was David or Tony that was the receiving editor, and then you would write to them, like old mail, and you take 3 copies. I mean, the amount of trees that must have been destroyed. You'd take 3 copies of your paper, and you'd write a letter, and then whichever person received it, they kept 1 copy, and they sent 2 to each of the reviewers, and then the reviewers would have to write their review, and sometimes they would mark up the paper copy, and so they would then post this back, and then David or Tony would get these. They'd have to wait for the 2 reviews to come in, and then they'd decide. And so then they'd have to write back to you as the author, and sometimes they would put in the marked up copy or whatever, and and it was so if you could imagine a paper. I mean, I don't know how many rounds papers went through, but if you went through 4 or 5 rounds, this was huge, and just I don't know how they did this, but just keeping track of all the papers in the system and chasing reviewers, because you always get reviewers that were late, and I don't know, so if David had, let's say, just taken over from Tony, and Tony had just asked someone to review, David wouldn't know that, so you could actually get 2 reviews almost in 2 weeks, and so for us so when we took over, the part of the thing was Elsevier wanted us to go onto the online platform, and it was, in terms of those logistics, really it's made it so much easier, because so the way it worked at first was Marcia did the first 18 months, and I took over, and then after that Marcia and I I did even submissions and she did odd submissions, so people, I think you could tell anyway which of us was dealing with it, but yes, but so if she'd just chosen someone to review a paper, I would honestly, often I would be doing my pile to do, and I'd go and look, and I'd often pick exactly the same reviewer, but of course I could see then that straight away in the system if that reviewer had already done a paper and when they last did the review, and so so logistically, and of course without all the filing and chasing people up, you could just go through all the papers and see who owed a review, and you then send them an email through the system, and anyway, so the logistics were much easier. But then I think, and Eve probably took over, so we were still on the tail end of that system, and then they brought, for some reason, I mean, it was multi-million, could have even been $1 billion system, which was eVise, and it was completely awful, and it was it was so awful. After 2 years they had to revert back to the other system, And even the new system is now just like a slightly amended version of the very first system that I took over when I took over as an editor at CPA. So, but it was like we wanted to try and understand what was in the advice that was good, because clearly it was good for them as publishers, but why wasn't it good for us as academics? And it's like they clearly had another agenda about what they wanted from their system. And then I think we were kind of sold that system on the basis that it had these functions. So like if you could get reviewer suggestions, I think was the thing that really annoyed me the most. Well, you didn't have to use it, but it was like this was being promoted as a really important thing. So it was clear then that Elsevier had collected data on individual people. So like the keywords in your work, what your H factor was, if you've been a good reviewer in the past, like how long it takes you normally to do a review, what your all of that significant amount of information on individuals was in their system, such that Elsevier could receive a manuscript, somehow from that manuscript, there was some algorithm that would enable that submission then to be fed into a system that would then suggest a reviewer. And so we were really, I suppose that was the thing that started us thinking about the algorithm and all the stuff that was kind of going on, as you say, in the backstage, like all of the artificial intelligence that we have no control over and know nothing about. And I think so we recently did a podcast, and this is from a data equality lab in Scarborough University in Toronto, and it's someone called Leslie Chan, I think their name is, but I hope I got that right. And they do different podcasts on, I suppose, artificial intelligence and so on and so forth. But there was one podcast that they did that was looking at Elsevier, and I didn't know this. They own LexisNexis, and they scrape that data, who's looking at what, and they actually sell it to I think lots of it probably goes to the US government, and they call that their risk division. So I don't know how, I think you have to work in a university to get LexisNexis or pay a big subscription. I don't know, but I think that's right. So it's like they're looking at people in universities or people that have got, students and, PhD students as well as staff that have actually got kind of library logins that they can actually follow all this information about you. So, so there's the academic freedom aspect of, and we don't know this. It'd be interesting to find out if other journals do use this reviewer selection kind of tool. Honestly, if you were really, really overworked, I could see that this would be quite tempting to use this tool. Because at the moment, we receive the manuscript. It takes, a couple of hours to have a good read through it. And even then, that's not reading it really, really, really carefully. And you're thinking about, is this a fit for the journal? Could we help to get, to raise this up to the standard if it's not the standard? If it's not a fit, sometimes, we get lots of mainstream capital markets papers that, are easy. We know they're not a fit. But even, journal submissions with big data, it's like, well, would this actually be interesting for our readership? So who could review it? You're thinking about all of those things. So, let's say that some are really quick because they're not, the manuscripts are not for fit, but other ones, they're very time consuming. If you've got a big pressure on you, the easiest thing would just be to click on the reviewer suggestion thing and just accept that reviewer. So, we don't know whether people use these functions. So, yes, I think Elsevier is a big data collection machine. like, I'm sure lots of the stuff, it may be like the power company that I told you about. They know they've got lots of this data and they don't know how they're going to monetize it. But, it's just kind of, and I think it's just dangerous because we have no control over it.
Yeah, and it feels like a space that's developing, and it's interesting where these things go. But yeah, that's so interesting, especially for me as not having any editorial experience, to hear about that. It's slightly scary because you imagine it just seems like something, an algorithm is least suited for, because it requires so much judgment and critical thinking. So it's kind of interesting that it's being used in that way. So yeah, thank you for touching on that. I wonder if maybe to finish off, if reflecting on the field as it is now in critical accounting, what would your advice be to either an early career researcher or maybe a PhD student considering a career in critical accounting?
Yeah, so I think probably like some of the stuff that I've already said is like, I think our jobs have become more and more difficult. Having said that, I mean, for me, I suppose I've loved my career. For lots of different aspects, but the research side of it, I do have time to research stuff that I'm really passionate about and interested in. And I suppose if you're a PhD student or you're someone thinking about doing a PhD in this area with a view to becoming an academic, if you're not passionate about this stuff, it probably isn't for you, because you need that to be able to, I suppose, keep going. Because there is honestly, you can do a really good manuscript and send it to a journal and just the reviewers just don't like it. So rejection is really hard, but it's going to be part of your life. And I think all the big cheese, well, I don't know about all of them, but the ones that I know, we all get rejected. And it's really, you put 2 or 3 years sometimes of your life into something and it gets rejected. It's, it's not easy. And you're always under this pressure to keep publishing and publishing. But nonetheless, it might be worse if you're just churning out stuff just for the sake of it and it keeps getting rejected. At least if you're passionate about it, then you've learned something personally and it feeds into your teaching, and you can think about sending it somewhere else. It is. I think it is hard. I suppose in terms of advice, to try and talk to peers and build alliances so that you all care about each other. I think the danger is if you become ultra competitive against everyone else that you ever meet. And I know sometimes you get this with young researchers. You send them a paper to review and they're incredibly harsh on that manuscript, and it's like, no, this isn't a zero-sum game where if you get everything else rejected, then we're going to have to publish your work. Honestly, you're as one individual, probably you're not going to be able to do that. So I think it's good if you see yourself as part of a community that's very supportive, which I actually think our community is. So make really good, lasting friends that you can bounce your ideas off. Because it's really hard to get people to read your work and comment on it. So if you're, in a group, that makes it, I suppose, much easier.
I really resonate with that. I think what you're saying is super important, and it kind of touches on what you're saying about neoliberalism as well. We're kind of in a place where it encourages us to be competitive, but actually there's a lot to be gained from being kind of collegiate and sharing your ideas and helping other people out, because what goes around comes around as well.
It really does. Yeah.
Cool, fantastic. And as someone who's just finished the PhD as well, I suppose everybody gets sick of their PhD project at some point as well, we should probably say. And it is quite nice that you can maybe, once that is done, I guess, you can to some extent choose your projects and choose who you work with and things like that. Christine, thank you so much for your time. It's been amazing to talk to you. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. It's been nice to reflect.